Lieutenant James Jimmy Anderson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stood on the scorching tarmac of Henderson Field. The year was 1942, and the Solomon Islands had become a living nightmare for American forces trapped in the Pacific Theater. The sun beat down mercilessly on Guadalcanal, but it wasn't the heat that made Jimmy's hands shake as he checked his flight instruments for the third time that morning. At 23 years old, Jimmy had already flown more combat missions than most pilots would see in their entire careers. His P-38 Lightning fighter plane sat waiting on the makeshift runway, its twin engines gleaming in the tropical sun. The aircraft had become his lifeline, his weapon, and his only ticket home from this green hell in the middle of nowhere. The mission briefing had been simple enough. Intelligence reports indicated that a transport plane carrying wounded American soldiers had gone down somewhere in the dense jungle of Bougainville Island, roughly 200 miles northwest of their current position. The plane had been attempting to evacuate critically injured men from a field hospital when Japanese Zero fighters had intercepted it. The last radio transmission had been garbled and desperate, but it was clear that survivors were on the ground and time was running out. What made this mission different from all the others was that Jimmy would be flying alone. Every other available pilot was either dead, wounded, or assigned to protect the airfield from incoming Japanese bombing raids. The squadron had lost 6 planes in the past week alone, and replacement pilots were nowhere to be found. Command had made it clear that this was a volunteer mission with almost no chance of success. Jimmy had volunteered without hesitation. Growing up on a farm in Nebraska, Jimmy had learned early that sometimes you had to do things alone. When his father died in a farming accident, 13-year-old Jimmy had taken over the responsibilities of running the family farm, while his mother worked in town to make ends meet. He had learned to fix machinery, tend livestock, and make difficult decisions when there was no one else around to help. Those skills had served him well in pilot training, where his instructors noted his unusual ability to remain calm under pressure and think clearly when everything around him was falling apart. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the reality of aerial combat in the Pacific. The Japanese pilots were skilled, experienced, and utterly fearless. They flew their Zero fighters with a precision that bordered on supernatural, and they showed no mercy to American pilots who found themselves alone in the vast expanse of ocean and sky. Jimmy had already shot down 4 enemy aircraft, but he had also watched too many of his friends spiral into the dark waters below, their planes trailing smoke and fire. As he performed his pre-flight checks, Jimmy thought about the men who might be waiting for rescue on Bougainville. He didn't know their names or their faces, but he knew they were counting on someone to find them before the Japanese ground forces did. In the Pacific Theater, being captured meant torture, starvation, and almost certain death. The Japanese military had made it clear that they considered American prisoners to be less than human. The intelligence officer, Captain Morrison, approached Jimmy's plane with a grim expression. Morrison was a thin, nervous man who had been in the Pacific for 18 months without rotation home. The constant stress had taken its toll, and his hands trembled slightly as he handed Jimmy a folded map. "The last known position is here," Morrison said, pointing to a small circle drawn in red pencil. "But that was 3 days ago. They could be anywhere within a 20-mile radius by now, assuming they're still alive." Jimmy studied the map carefully. Bougainville Island was covered in thick jungle, with mountains rising over 8,000 feet above sea level. The terrain was some of the most difficult in the Pacific, with hidden valleys, rushing rivers, and canopies so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Finding a downed aircraft in that environment would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. "What about Japanese air activity in the area?" Jimmy asked. Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "Heavy. We've identified at least 2 squadrons of Zero fighters operating from Kahili Airfield. They've been patrolling the area constantly since the transport went down. Intelligence believes they're looking for survivors too." Jimmy nodded grimly. The race was on, and the Japanese had a significant head start. The flight to Bougainville would take Jimmy over some of the most dangerous airspace in the Pacific. He would have to fly low to avoid radar detection, but not so low that he couldn't see the jungle canopy clearly enough to spot any signs of the downed aircraft. The P-38 Lightning was fast and heavily armed, but it was also a large target that would stand out against the blue sky like a beacon. As Jimmy climbed into his cockpit, he caught sight of his reflection in the aircraft's glass canopy. The face looking back at him seemed older than his 23 years. The constant stress, lack of sleep, and poor food had taken their toll on all the men stationed at Henderson Field. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his cheeks had hollowed out from weight loss, but his hands were steady as he started the engines and his mind was clear. He had a job to do and failure wasn't an option. Somewhere in the green hell of Bougainville Island, American soldiers were waiting for rescue. They were probably wounded, hungry, and terrified. They were counting on someone to find them before it was too late. The twin engines of the P-38 Lightning roared to life, drowning out the sounds of the jungle that surrounded Henderson Field. Jimmy taxied to the end of the runway, performed his final checks, and pushed the throttles forward. The fighter plane accelerated down the bumpy coral surface, lifted off into the humid air, and banked northwest toward Bougainville Island. Behind him, the other pilots and ground crew watched until his aircraft disappeared into the haze on the horizon. Most of them didn't expect to see Jimmy Anderson again. The odds were simply too great, and too many good men had already been lost attempting similar rescue missions. But Jimmy had something that many of his fellow pilots lacked: an absolute refusal to give up. As his plane climbed toward cruising altitude, he settled in for what might be the most important flight of his life. The flight to Bougainville Island stretched out before Jimmy like an endless blue carpet. For the first hour, he flew over open ocean, watching the waves roll beneath him in an hypnotic pattern that had lulled many pilots into dangerous complacency. But Jimmy kept his eyes moving constantly, scanning the horizon for the telltale glint of enemy aircraft. The P-38 Lightning performed flawlessly, its twin engines humming with mechanical precision. Jimmy had grown to trust his aircraft completely during his months in the Pacific. The Lightning was faster than the Japanese Zero fighters, and its heavy armament could tear through enemy planes like paper. But speed and firepower wouldn't help him much during a search and rescue mission that required slow, methodical flying over hostile territory. As Bougainville Island appeared on the horizon, Jimmy felt his heart rate increase. The island looked peaceful from a distance, with white beaches giving way to green jungle and purple mountains. But he knew that appearance was deceiving. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were hidden in those jungles, along with anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, and fighter planes waiting to pounce on any American aircraft that dared to venture too close. Jimmy descended to 5,000 feet and began his search pattern. According to the intelligence reports, the downed transport plane had been heading for a small clearing that served as an emergency landing strip for evacuation flights. The clearing was located in a valley roughly 15 miles inland from the coast, surrounded by mountains and thick jungle. The first pass over the area revealed nothing but an endless canopy of green. The jungle was so thick that Jimmy couldn't see the ground clearly, even from his relatively low altitude. He would have to fly lower, much lower, if he had any hope of spotting wreckage or survivors. At 2,000 feet, the details of the jungle began to emerge. Jimmy could see rivers snaking through the valleys, rocky outcroppings on the mountainsides, and occasional clearings where the canopy had been broken by storms or landslides. But there was still no sign of the missing aircraft. It was during his third pass over the search area that Jimmy spotted the first Zero fighter. The Japanese plane appeared suddenly from behind a ridge, climbing rapidly toward Jimmy's altitude. The pilot had obviously been waiting in ambush, using the mountainous terrain to mask his approach. Jimmy's training took over immediately, and he banked hard to the left while pushing his throttles to maximum power. The Zero was fast and maneuverable, but the P-38 Lightning had superior speed and altitude performance. Jimmy climbed rapidly, trying to gain the advantage of height while the Japanese pilot attempted to close the distance. The two aircraft began a deadly dance in the sky above Bougainville Island, each pilot trying to maneuver into a position where his guns could find their target. Jimmy had learned early in his combat career that patience was often more important than aggression in aerial combat. Many young American pilots had died because they tried to force a quick kill instead of waiting for the right opportunity. The Zero pilot was skilled and experienced, but he made the mistake of trying to turn fight with the Lightning instead of using his aircraft's superior maneuverability at lower speeds. The opportunity came when the Japanese pilot pulled too tight in a climbing turn, causing his aircraft to stall momentarily. Jimmy was ready, and his .850 caliber machine gun spoke with devastating effect. The Zero fighter disintegrated under the concentrated firepower, its pilot never having a chance to escape. But Jimmy's problems were just beginning. The sound of gunfire had attracted attention, and 2 more Zero fighters appeared from different directions. These pilots were more cautious than their dead comrade, and they worked together to trap Jimmy between them. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Jimmy's life. He used every trick he had learned during his months of combat flying, diving toward the jungle canopy to force the Japanese pilots to follow him into unfamiliar low-altitude flying, then climbing rapidly to gain altitude advantage. The Lightning's superior speed allowed him to extend away from his pursuers when things got too dangerous, but he couldn't shake them completely. The dogfight ranged across miles of jungle and mountain terrain. Jimmy found himself flying through valleys so narrow that his wingtips seemed to brush the trees on either side. He pulled G-forces that made his vision gray out and his body feel like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But gradually, his superior aircraft and hard-earned experience began to tell. The second Zero fell victim to a head-on attack that Jimmy had learned from a veteran pilot who had fought in the Battle of Britain. Instead of trying to outturn the more maneuverable Japanese fighter, Jimmy flew straight at it with his guns blazing. Most pilots would have panicked and turned away from such a collision course, but Jimmy held his nerve until the last possible second. The Zero pilot broke first, turning hard to avoid the head-on collision, and Jimmy's gunfire caught him in the turn. The third Japanese pilot was more experienced and cautious. He refused to be drawn into Jimmy's traps, instead maintaining his distance and waiting for an opportunity. The 2 aircraft circled each other like predators, each pilot looking for an opening. It was then that Jimmy made a decision that went against everything he had been taught in flight school. Instead of continuing the dogfight until one of them was dead, he broke off the engagement and dove toward the jungle canopy. The Japanese pilot followed as Jimmy had hoped, but the American had a plan. Flying barely 50 feet above the treetops, Jimmy led his pursuer on a twisting course through valleys and over ridges. The Zero pilot was skilled enough to keep up, but he was flying in unfamiliar territory at dangerous altitude. When Jimmy suddenly pulled up and over a ridge, the Japanese pilot had to choose between losing his target or following him over terrain he couldn't see. He chose to follow, and flew directly into a cliff face hidden behind the ridge. Jimmy was alone again, but the dogfight had consumed precious fuel and taken him miles away from his search area. He checked his fuel gauges and realized that he had perhaps 30 minutes of flying time remaining before he would have to turn back to Henderson Field. 30 minutes to find survivors who might be anywhere within a 20-mile radius of jungle. He returned to his search pattern, but this time he flew even lower, skimming the treetops at an altitude that would have terrified most pilots. At this height, he could see details in the jungle canopy that had been invisible from higher altitude. Broken trees, clearings, and most importantly, any signs of human activity. It was during his final pass over the search area that Jimmy saw something that made his heart skip a beat. In a small clearing near a river, barely visible through the jungle canopy, was a flash of reflected sunlight. It lasted only a second, but Jimmy had trained himself to notice such things. Metal reflected sunlight differently than water or leaves. He circled the area carefully, trying to get a better look without making himself an easy target for ground fire. The clearing was small, perhaps 50 yards across, and it was surrounded by jungle so thick that landing would be impossible. But there, half hidden by broken trees and torn metal, was the unmistakable shape of an aircraft wing. Jimmy had found the downed transport plane. Jimmy circled the crash site at low altitude, his eyes straining to make out details through the broken canopy of jungle trees. The transport plane had obviously hit hard, carving a path of destruction through the forest before coming to rest in the small clearing. One wing had been completely torn off and lay twisted among the trees, while the fuselage appeared to have broken in half during the impact. From his vantage point 500 feet above, Jimmy could see that the aircraft had been on the ground for several days. Vines were already beginning to grow over parts of the wreckage, and the bright aluminum skin of the plane had been dulled by moisture and jungle rot. But what caught his attention was something much more important than the condition of the aircraft. There were signs of life. A thin column of smoke was rising from what appeared to be a carefully concealed fire pit near the wreckage. Jimmy could also make out what looked like fabric stretched between trees, possibly a shelter or signal panel. Most encouraging of all, he could see movement in the shadows beneath the jungle canopy. Jimmy waggled his wings in the universal signal for friendly aircraft, hoping that any survivors below would recognize the gesture and respond. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, incredibly, he saw figures emerge from the jungle and wave frantically at his aircraft. The survivors were alive, but Jimmy's relief was tempered by the reality of his situation. His fuel gauges showed that he had perhaps 15 minutes of flying time remaining. Even if he turned for Henderson Field immediately, he would be cutting it dangerously close. There was no time for a detailed reconnaissance of the area, no time to determine how many survivors were on the ground or what condition they were in. Jimmy made a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of flying home immediately to report the location of the survivors, he decided to attempt something that had never been tried before in the Pacific Theater. He was going to try to evacuate the survivors using his single-seat fighter plane. The P-38 Lightning had never been designed to carry passengers. It was a fighter aircraft, built for speed and firepower, not transport duties. But Jimmy had noticed during his reconnaissance that there was a flat area near the crash site that might be long enough for a landing, if he was very careful and very lucky. The improvised landing strip was nothing more than a riverbed that had been temporarily dried by the seasonal rains. It was perhaps 300 yards long, bordered on both sides by dense jungle and large rocks. Landing a high-performance fighter aircraft on such terrain was normally considered impossible, but Jimmy had grown up landing small planes on rough farm strips in Nebraska. Jimmy made one more pass over the area to judge wind direction and identify potential obstacles. The survivors below had obviously realized what he was attempting, because they were frantically clearing debris from the makeshift runway and waving him toward the smoothest section of the riverbed. On his final approach, Jimmy reduced power to minimum and deployed his landing flaps. The P-38 Lightning descended toward the jungle like a falling leaf, its twin engines barely above idle. Jimmy could see the faces of the survivors now, and he was shocked by their condition. These men had been through hell. The touchdown was harder than Jimmy would have liked, but the landing gear held. The Lightning bounced twice on the rough surface before settling down and rolling toward the far end of the makeshift runway. Jimmy applied his brakes carefully, knowing that too much pressure would cause the aircraft to nose over in the soft sand. The fighter plane came to a stop with perhaps 50 feet to spare. Jimmy shut down his engines and popped the canopy, immediately hit by the overwhelming heat and humidity of the jungle. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of rotting vegetation, but there was something else in the atmosphere that made his skin crawl. The unmistakable scent of death. The survivors reached his aircraft within minutes. There were 7 of them, all in various stages of injury and exhaustion. Their uniforms were torn and filthy, and most showed signs of infected wounds that had been treated with improvised bandages. But they were alive, and their eyes shone with desperate hope. The senior survivor was Staff Sergeant Mike Collins, a medic who had been aboard the transport plane when it was shot down. Collins was wounded himself, with a deep gash on his left arm that had become badly infected, but he had managed to keep his fellow survivors alive for 4 days in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. "Thank God you found us," Collins said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've been hearing Japanese patrols getting closer every day. They know we're here somewhere." Jimmy quickly assessed the situation. 7 survivors, 1 small fighter plane, and Japanese soldiers somewhere in the surrounding jungle. The mathematics were brutally simple. There was no way his aircraft could carry 7 additional people, even if they had been in perfect health. "How many of these men can walk?" Jimmy asked. Collins looked around at his companions with obvious pain. 3 of the survivors were seriously wounded and could barely sit up, let alone walk through miles of jungle. 2 others were in better condition but were suffering from infected wounds and tropical diseases that had left them weak and disoriented. "Maybe 2, including myself," Collins admitted. "The others, they're not going to make it much longer without proper medical care." Jimmy realized that he was faced with an impossible choice. He could take 2 of the healthiest survivors and fly them back to Henderson Field, leaving the others to almost certain death, or he could stay and try to help all of them, knowing that Japanese patrols were closing in and that his presence would only make their situation more dangerous. But Jimmy Anderson had not grown up on a Nebraska farm learning to quit when things got difficult. He had watched his father die because help didn't arrive in time, and he had sworn that he would never abandon anyone who was counting on him. "We're going to get everyone out," he told Collins, "but we're going to have to be creative about it." Jimmy's plan was audacious and probably suicidal, but it was the only option that didn't involve leaving wounded men to die in the jungle. He would fly the 2 healthiest survivors back to Henderson Field immediately, then return with supplies and a more detailed plan for evacuating the others. It would require multiple trips over hostile territory, and each landing at the improvised airstrip would be more dangerous than the last. Collins stared at Jimmy as if he had lost his mind. "You can't keep landing here. The Japanese will figure out what's happening and set up an ambush. This whole area will be crawling with soldiers by tomorrow." Jimmy nodded grimly. "Then we'd better work fast." As the afternoon sun began to set over Bougainville Island, Jimmy helped Collins and one other survivor climb onto the wing of his aircraft. There was no room in the cockpit for passengers, so the 2 men would have to hold on to whatever handholds they could find and pray that Jimmy's flying skills were as good as advertised. The takeoff from the riverbed was even more dangerous than the landing had been. With the additional weight of 2 passengers clinging to his aircraft, the P-38 Lightning was sluggish and difficult to control. Jimmy used every inch of the available runway before finally coaxing his overladen fighter into the air. As they climbed away from the jungle clearing, Jimmy caught sight of movement in the trees below. Japanese soldiers were already approaching the crash site, drawn by the sound of aircraft engines. The race against time had begun, and Jimmy was already behind. The flight back to Henderson Field with 2 wounded soldiers clinging to the outside of his aircraft was the longest 30 minutes of Jimmy's life. Staff Sergeant Collins and Private Rodriguez held on desperately to whatever handholds they could find on the Lightning's wing. Their faces pressed against the metal skin of the aircraft as tropical wind tore at their clothes and bodies. Jimmy flew as smoothly as possible, avoiding sudden turns or altitude changes that might throw his human cargo from the aircraft. But the P-38 Lightning had never been designed for such a mission, and every slight turbulence bump threatened to tear the wounded. Men from their precarious perches, Collins had secured himself with a length of parachute cord tied around his waist and fastened to the aircraft's gun mounts. But Rodriguez was in worse condition and could barely maintain his grip on the wing. Jimmy could see the private's face in his mirror, pale and drawn with exhaustion and pain. The man's infected leg wound had reopened during the rescue, and blood was streaming down his uniform. As Henderson Field appeared on the horizon, Jimmy faced another challenge. He had to land his aircraft safely, while ensuring that his passengers survived the touchdown. The Lightning's landing speed was much higher than most transport aircraft, and the coral runway at Henderson Field was rough and unforgiving. Jimmy keyed his radio and called the control tower. "Henderson Tower, this is Lightning 27 requesting emergency landing clearance. I have wounded personnel on board." The tower operator's voice crackled back through the static. "Lightning 27, you're cleared for emergency landing on runway 12. Medical personnel are standing by." What the tower operator couldn't see was that Jimmy's wounded personnel were not inside the aircraft, but clinging to its wing like human barnacles. As Jimmy lined up for his final approach, he could see the faces of ground personnel staring in amazement at the sight of a fighter plane carrying external passengers. The landing was gentle but firm, and Jimmy held his breath as the aircraft settled onto the coral runway. Both Collins and Rodriguez managed to hold on, though Rodriguez collapsed immediately after the plane came to a stop. Medical corpsmen rushed to the aircraft and carefully helped both men down from the wing. Captain Morrison appeared at Jimmy's cockpit before the engines had completely shut down. The intelligence officer's face was a mixture of amazement and disbelief. "Anderson, what the hell did you just do?" Morrison demanded. Jimmy climbed out of his cockpit, his legs shaky from adrenaline and exhaustion. "I found the survivors, sir. But there are 5 more men still on the ground, and they're in bad shape. The Japanese are closing in on their position." Morrison's expression grew serious. "How many enemy aircraft did you encounter?" 3 Zeros. I shot down all of them, but there will be more. They know something is happening in that area." Jimmy quickly briefed Morrison on the situation at the crash site. The 5 remaining survivors were critically wounded and could not walk out through the jungle. The improvised landing strip was barely adequate for a single-engine aircraft, and Japanese ground forces were already moving toward the area. Morrison listened to the report with growing concern. "Anderson, what you're describing is a suicide mission. Even if you could land there again, which is doubtful, You'd never be able to evacuate 5 seriously wounded men with a single fighter aircraft. Jimmy had been thinking about that problem during his flight back to Henderson Field, and he had reached a desperate conclusion. "Sir, I need to go back tonight. If I wait until tomorrow, those men will be dead or captured." Morrison shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. Night flying over that terrain is impossible, and you'd never find the crash site in the dark." But Jimmy had already considered that obstacle as well. "The survivors have been maintaining a signal fire. If I approach from the east, I should be able to spot the smoke against the stars." What Jimmy didn't tell Morrison was that he had noticed something else during his reconnaissance of the crash site. About 2 miles south of the survivors' position, there was a larger clearing that appeared to be an abandoned Japanese airfield. If he could land there instead of the riverbed, he might have room to load all 5 remaining survivors into his aircraft at the same time. It would require removing the armor plating from his fighter plane to reduce weight, and the men would have to be packed into the aircraft like cargo, but it might be possible. The biggest risk was that the airfield might still be occupied by Japanese forces, in which case Jimmy would be flying directly into a trap. As the medical corpsmen loaded Collins and Rodriguez onto stretchers, Collins grabbed Jimmy's arm with surprising strength. "You're going back for them, aren't you?" Collins asked. Jimmy nodded. "Tonight, if possible." Collins closed his eyes for a moment, then looked directly at Jimmy. "Listen to me, Lieutenant. Those men won't last another day. The Japanese have been using dogs to track us, and they're getting close. But there's something else you need to know." Collins glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then continued in a whisper. "One of the men you left behind is carrying intelligence documents, critical stuff about Japanese troop movements and fortifications. If those documents fall into enemy hands, a lot of American soldiers are going to die." Jimmy felt a chill run down his spine. The rescue mission had just become much more complicated. It wasn't just about saving 5 wounded men anymore. It was about protecting information that could affect the outcome of the entire Pacific campaign. Morrison had overheard enough of the conversation to understand the implications. He pulled Jimmy aside and spoke in urgent, clipped tones. "Anderson, if what Collins says is true, then this mission just became a priority operation. But I still can't authorize a night flight over hostile territory with a single aircraft." Jimmy looked Morrison directly in the eye. "Sir, with respect, I'm not asking for authorization. Those men are going to die if someone doesn't go back for them, and I'm the only pilot who knows where they are." Morrison stared at Jimmy for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "If you're determined to do this, you're going to need help. We can't spare any fighters for escort, but I can arrange for a diversionary bombing raid on the other side of the island. It might draw some of the Japanese attention away from your area." Jimmy shook hands with Morrison, knowing that both men understood this might be the last time they saw each other alive. The intelligence officer had tears in his eyes as he watched Jimmy walk back toward his aircraft. The ground crew worked frantically to prepare the P-38 Lightning for its second mission of the day. They removed the heavy armor plating from around the cockpit, stripped out unnecessary equipment, and filled every available fuel tank. The aircraft would be lighter and have longer range, but Jimmy would also be more vulnerable to enemy fire. As the sun set over Guadalcanal, Jimmy performed his pre-flight checks by the light of portable lanterns. The mechanics had done their work well, but everyone knew that this mission was beyond the normal capabilities of both pilot and aircraft. Jimmy's hands were steady as he started his engines for the second time that day, but his mind was racing through all the things that could go wrong. Night navigation over unmarked jungle terrain, landing on an unknown airfield that might be occupied by enemy forces, and evacuating 5 critically wounded men with an aircraft that had no room for passengers. As he taxied toward the runway, Jimmy caught sight of Collins being loaded into an ambulance. The sergeant raised his hand in a weak salute, and Jimmy returned the gesture through his cockpit window. The P-38 Lightning lifted off into the tropical night, its engines echoing across the darkened airfield. Behind, Jimmy lay the relative safety of Henderson Field. Ahead lay 200 miles of hostile territory and a mission that defied every rule of military aviation. But somewhere in the jungle of Bougainville Island, 5 American soldiers were counting on him to bring them home. The first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep over the mountains of Bougainville Island as Jimmy and the survivors reached his aircraft. Time was running out quickly, and Jimmy knew that once the sun came up, Japanese observation post would be able to spot his fighter plane from miles away. The P-38 Lightning had never been designed to carry passengers, but Jimmy's ground crew had removed everything possible to reduce weight and create space. The armor plating was gone, non-essential equipment had been stripped out, and even the radio had been lightened by removing backup components. Even so, getting 5 wounded men into the aircraft was going to be like solving an impossible puzzle. Private Johnson was still unconscious and would have to be secured somehow to prevent him from falling out during flight. Sergeant Williams was delirious with fever, but conscious enough to follow basic instructions. The other 3 survivors were in better condition but still weak from their ordeal. Jimmy opened every access panel and removed every seat cushion, creating as much internal space as possible. Corporal Martinez, as the healthiest of the survivors, would have to sit in the narrow space behind the pilot's seat where the radio equipment had been removed. 2 other men could fit in the ammunition bays, lying flat among the machine gun belts. But Private Johnson and Sergeant Williams presented a more serious challenge. Both men were too badly injured to sit upright or hold on during flight, and there was simply no secure space inside the cockpit for them. Jimmy made a decision that went against every safety regulation in military aviation. Johnson and Williams would have to be strapped to the outside of the aircraft, secured to the wing hardpoints that normally carried external fuel tanks or bombs. Using parachute cord and torn fabric, Jimmy and Martinez fashioned crude but secure harnesses that would hold the 2 wounded men against the aircraft's wing. It was incredibly dangerous, and both men would be fully exposed to wind, weather, and enemy fire during the flight home. But it was the only way to evacuate everyone. As they worked to secure the wounded men to the aircraft, Jimmy could hear the distant sound of vehicles on the roads that led to the airfield. The diversionary bombing raid had ended hours ago, and Japanese patrols were returning to their normal search patterns. It would not be long before enemy soldiers discovered the abandoned airfield and realized what was happening. Johnson never regained consciousness as they strapped him to the left wing of the Lightning. Williams was aware enough to understand what was happening, and he gripped Jimmy's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you for coming back for us," Williams whispered through cracked lips. "We never thought anyone would find us." Jimmy squeezed the sergeant's hand in return. "We don't leave our people behind," he said simply. The final preparations took precious minutes that Jimmy didn't have. He performed a hasty pre-flight inspection, checking that all the external passengers were securely fastened and that the aircraft's control surfaces were still free to move. The Lightning was overloaded far beyond its design limits, and Jimmy had no idea whether it would even be able to get off the ground. As Jimmy climbed into his cockpit, he could see dust clouds on the horizon that indicated approaching vehicles. Japanese search parties were converging on the airfield, probably drawn by reports of aircraft engine noise during the night. The P-38 Lightning's engines coughed to life, shattering the morning silence. Jimmy didn't bother with a gradual warm-up procedure. There was no time for normal procedures. He pushed the throttles forward and began his takeoff roll down the concrete runway. The overloaded fighter plane accelerated slowly, much more slowly than Jimmy had expected. The additional weight of 5 passengers was pushing the aircraft beyond its performance envelope, and the engines strained to generate enough power for flight. Jimmy used every inch of the runway before finally coaxing the Lightning into the air. The climb rate was painfully slow, and Jimmy could see Japanese vehicles reaching the perimeter of the airfield as his aircraft finally cleared the surrounding trees. Soldiers were jumping out of trucks and pointing at the departing airplane, and Jimmy knew that radio reports were already being transmitted to fighter bases across the island. Flying with 5 external passengers required Jimmy to be extremely gentle with the controls. Any sudden maneuver could throw the men from the aircraft or damage the improvised harnesses that held them in place. But gentle flying also meant slow flying, and Japanese Zero fighters would soon be hunting for his overloaded aircraft. Jimmy flew as low as possible to avoid radar detection, skimming just above the jungle canopy, at an altitude that would have been considered reckless under normal circumstances. The Lightning's engines ran smoothly, but Jimmy could feel the aircraft struggle with the additional weight and drag. 20 minutes into the flight, Jimmy's worst fears were realized. 3 Japanese Zero fighters appeared on the horizon, climbing rapidly to intercept his aircraft. The enemy pilots had obviously been scrambled as soon as reports reached their base, and they were flying much faster than Jimmy's overloaded Lightning could manage. Jimmy's options were extremely limited. He couldn't outrun the Japanese fighters, and he couldn't maneuver aggressively without risking the lives of his passengers. His only hope was to stay low and try to reach Henderson Field before the enemy pilots could close the distance. The chase lasted 30 agonizing minutes. Jimmy flew through valleys and between mountain peaks, using the terrain to mask his aircraft from enemy radar and visual detection. The Zero fighters were faster, but Jimmy knew the area better, and he used every geographical feature to his advantage. Several times, the Japanese pilots nearly caught up to him, forcing Jimmy to dive toward the ocean surface or climb over ridges at dangerous angles. Each maneuver put tremendous stress on the improvised passenger restraints, and Jimmy could see Williams gripping the wing with white knuckles as wind tore at his body. As Henderson Field finally appeared on the horizon, Jimmy realized that his fuel situation was becoming critical. The extra weight and the evasive maneuvers had consumed more fuel than he had calculated, and his gauges showed that he was running on vapors. But the Japanese fighters were still behind him, and they showed no intention of breaking off the pursuit. Jimmy would have to land his aircraft under fire. With 5 wounded men attached to the outside of his fighter plane, Jimmy keyed his radio and called Henderson Field. Tower, this is Lightning 27 requesting immediate emergency landing clearance. I am carrying wounded personnel and am being pursued by enemy aircraft. The response was immediate and professional. Lightning 27, you are cleared for emergency landing on any runway. We have you in sight and are vectoring fighters to assist. As Jimmy lined up for his final approach, he could see American P-40 fighters climbing to intercept the pursuing Japanese aircraft. But the Zero fighters had one last chance to attack the overloaded Lightning, and they pressed their advantage aggressively. Gunfire erupted around Jimmy's aircraft as he descended toward the runway. Bullets punched holes through the wings and fuselage, but miraculously none of the external passengers were hit. Jimmy felt the aircraft shudder as enemy rounds found their mark, but the engines continued to run smoothly. The landing was harder than Jimmy would have preferred, but all 5 passengers survived the touchdown. As the Lightning rolled to a stop on Henderson Field's coral runway, American fighters engaged the Japanese pursuers overhead in a brief but violent dogfight. Medical corpsmen rushed to the aircraft and carefully removed the wounded survivors from their improvised restraints. Private Johnson was still unconscious but alive, his pulse weak but steady. Sergeant Williams managed a weak smile as stretcher-bearers carried him toward the field hospital. Corporal Martinez was the last to leave the aircraft, and he carried with him the intelligence documents that had made the mission so critical. The information he had protected during 4 days in the jungle would indeed prove vital to American operations in the Pacific. Flying over the Pacific Ocean at night in 1942 was like traveling through a black void. Jimmy's instruments glowed softly in the darkness of his cockpit, the only reliable guides in a world where the ocean and sky blended into an endless expanse of nothingness. Stars provided some navigation reference, but clouds frequently obscured them, leaving Jimmy to rely on dead reckoning and hope. The diversionary bombing raid that Morrison had promised was already underway. Jimmy could see flashes of explosions on the horizon to the west, where American B-25 bombers were attacking Japanese positions near Kahili Airfield. The raid would hopefully draw enemy fighters away from Jimmy's target area, but it also meant that every Japanese soldier on Bougainville Island was now on high alert. As Jimmy approached the island, he descended to just a few hundred feet above the water to avoid Japanese radar stations. Flying this low in darkness was incredibly dangerous, especially over unfamiliar terrain, but it was the only way to reach the survivors undetected. The first challenge was finding the crash site in complete darkness. Jimmy had memorized the landmarks during his daylight reconnaissance, but everything looked different at night. Rivers became thin silver lines, mountains were black silhouettes against star-filled sky, and the dense jungle canopy swallowed all traces of human activity. Jimmy flew a careful search pattern, looking for any sign of the signal fire that the survivors were supposed to maintain. For 30 minutes he found nothing but endless darkness. His fuel gauges showed that he had perhaps an hour of flying time remaining before he would have to turn back, and panic began to creep into his thoughts. Then, just as he was beginning to consider abandoning the mission, Jimmy spotted a faint orange glow in a valley about 5 miles east of where he expected to find it. The survivors had moved their position, probably because Japanese patrols were getting too close to their original location. Jimmy circled the area once to confirm what he was seeing. The glow was definitely a carefully controlled fire, and it was located in a small clearing that he hadn't noticed during his daylight reconnaissance. More importantly, he could see the abandoned Japanese airfield that he had spotted earlier, located just 2 miles away across a low ridge. The airfield appeared to be completely dark, with no signs of enemy activity. If Jimmy could land there instead of the riverbed near the crash site, he would have much more room to maneuver his aircraft and load the wounded survivors. But approaching an unknown airfield at night was one of the most dangerous things a pilot could attempt. Jimmy made his decision and turned toward the airfield. As he descended toward what he hoped was the runway, he could make out more details in the pale starlight. The Japanese had built a substantial facility here, with concrete runways, revetments for aircraft, and several buildings that appeared to be hangars or maintenance shops. But the facility was clearly abandoned. Jimmy could see bomb damage from earlier American raids, and there were no lights or signs of human activity anywhere on the base. The Japanese had obviously pulled back to more defensible positions closer to their main bases. Landing on an unknown runway in complete darkness required skills that weren't taught in any flight school. Jimmy lined up what appeared to be the main runway and made a shallow approach, using his aircraft's landing lights only at the last moment to avoid revealing his position to enemy observers. The touchdown was surprisingly smooth, and Jimmy quickly realized why the Japanese had built an airfield at this location. The runway was longer and wider than anything at Henderson Field, constructed of concrete instead of coral, and oriented to take advantage of the prevailing winds. Jimmy taxied to what appeared to be a dispersal area near the edge of the runway and shut down his engines. The silence that followed was overwhelming after hours of engine noise, broken only by the distant sounds of insects and nightbirds in the surrounding jungle. He had landed successfully, but now came the most dangerous part of the mission. Jimmy had to travel 2 miles through hostile jungle at night to reach the survivors, then somehow get them back to his aircraft before Japanese patrols discovered his presence. Jimmy had brought a small pack with medical supplies, water, and emergency rations. He also carried his service pistol and a combat knife, though he knew that if he encountered enemy soldiers, his only real option would be to run and hide. A single American pilot was no match for Japanese infantry in their own territory. The jungle at night was a nightmare world of strange sounds, unseen movement, and invisible obstacles. Jimmy had grown up hunting in the woods around his family's farm, but nothing in Nebraska had prepared him for this environment. Every shadow could hide an enemy soldier. Every sound might signal approaching danger, and the thick canopy blocked out most of the starlight that might have helped with navigation. Jimmy followed what appeared to be a game trail toward the survivor's position, moving as quietly as possible through the undergrowth. Several times he had to freeze in place as he heard voices in the distance, presumably Japanese patrol units searching for the missing Americans. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Jimmy reached the edge of the clearing where he had seen the signal fire. He could smell wood smoke and something else that made his stomach turn, the unmistakable odor of infected wounds and human suffering. "American soldier," Jimmy called out softly. "I'm here to take you home." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 5 men emerged from concealed positions around the clearing, and Jimmy was shocked by their condition. These soldiers had been through hell during their 4 days in the jungle. Their uniforms were torn and filthy, their faces were gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, and most showed signs of serious injuries that had received only basic first aid. The senior man was Corporal David Martinez, a communications specialist who had been tasked with carrying the intelligence documents that Collins had mentioned. Martinez was in better condition than the others, but even he was weak from infected wounds and tropical diseases. "Lieutenant Anderson?" Martinez asked in disbelief. "How did you find us in the dark?" Jimmy quickly explained his plan to evacuate all 5 men using the abandoned Japanese airfield. The soldiers listened with growing amazement as he described the risks he had taken to reach them, but Martinez shook his head when he heard the plan. "Sir, 2 of these men can barely walk. Private Johnson hasn't been conscious for 6 hours, and Sergeant Williams has a broken leg that we set with tree branches. I don't see how we can get them 2 miles through this jungle." Jimmy looked around at the wounded soldiers and realized that Martinez was right. These men were in no condition for a forced march through hostile territory, especially at night. But they were also in no condition to survive another day in the jungle. "We'll have to carry them," Jimmy said finally. "It's not going to be easy, but it's the only option we have." What followed was one of the most difficult physical challenges that any of these men had ever attempted. Using improvised stretchers made from branches and torn fabric, Jimmy and the two healthiest survivors began the slow, exhausting process of carrying their wounded comrades through 2 miles of jungle darkness. Private Johnson was unconscious and had to be carried completely dead weight. Sergeant Williams was semi-conscious but delirious with fever, and he occasionally cried out in pain or confusion. The sound of his voice echoing through the jungle made everyone freeze in terror, waiting to see if enemy patrols had heard them. The journey took over 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and listen for signs of Japanese soldiers. Several times they had to hide in the undergrowth as patrol units passed nearby, holding their breath and praying that the wounded men would remain quiet. When they finally reached the edge of the abandoned airfield, Jimmy felt a surge of relief at seeing his aircraft still sitting where he had left it. But that relief quickly turned to concern as he realized the magnitude of the challenge still ahead. Getting 5 wounded men into a single-seat fighter aircraft was going to require creativity, determination, and more than a little luck, and they had to do it all before the sun came up and revealed their position to every Japanese soldier on Bougainville Island. As Jimmy shut down his engines for the final time, Captain Morrison appeared at his cockpit with tears in his eyes. The intelligence officer had never expected to see Jimmy Anderson again, and the success of the impossible rescue mission had left him speechless. Jimmy climbed out of his cockpit on unsteady legs, his body exhausted from 24 hours of continuous stress and fear. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his hands were shaking from adrenaline, and his eyes were red-rimmed from fatigue. But all 7 of the transport plane's survivors were alive and safe. In a war where so many rescue attempts ended in failure and death, Jimmy Anderson had accomplished something that military historians would later call impossible. The forgotten airman who had faced the flames of hell to bring his people home had succeeded against all odds. And though his name would never appear in the history books or on any monument, the 7 men whose lives he had saved would never forget the young pilot from Nebraska who refused to leave them behind in the jungle darkness of Bougainville Island. Years later, when Jimmy returned to his family's farm after the war, he would rarely speak about his experiences in the Pacific. But on quiet evenings when the Nebraska wind swept across the prairie, he would sometimes look up at the stars and remember 5 wounded soldiers who had trusted him to bring them home through the darkness.